Welcome to the Broken and Healed podcast, the podcast where science and health meet the miraculous. I'm your host, Michelle Katz, and this is a space for truth-telling, exploration, and deep healing. Here, we go beyond the surface to explore real stories, radical breakthroughs, and the hidden pathways to wholeness that the world often overlooks. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. I am here with Dr. J. Bernstein. Dr. J. Bernstein is a highly accomplished emergency medicine physician, educator, and U.S. Army National Guard veteran with over 3 decades of experience in clinical care, academic medicine, and public health. He earned his medical degree from the University of Massachusetts Medical School and completed his general surgery internship at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York, followed by an internal medicine internship at Newton Wellesley Hospital. Dr. Bernstein went on to complete an academic emergency medicine residency at Boston University. He holds a Master's of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a Master's in Healthcare Administration from Rosalind Franklin University. His broad clinical experience includes geriatrics, telemedicine, outpatient surgery, and occupational medicine, alongside roles as an EMS medical director and academic leader overseeing medical school clinical curricula. A retired major who served in combat during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Dr. Bernstein continues to speak out about corruption in clinical medicine and medical education. Having been featured on multiple podcasts, he is currently practicing emergency medicine and plans to open an integrative medicine practice in Florida in September. Now, Dr. Bernstein's pedigree and history is so lengthy and so impressive that I actually had to boil it down to just those aspects, which are in of themselves incredibly powerful and incredibly impressive. And I feel really honored to have Dr. Bernstein on today, who is really kind of a leader in this field of truther medicine, practitioner, kind of hero. So how are you today?
Great. Thanks for that introduction. Appreciate it.
You bet. Well, it's really amazing to have you on. And as you know, and anybody who knows my story knows, I am very deeply entwined with the whole narrative and story of how allopathic medicine and in a sense, the history of what I'd call Rockefeller medicine has become a different kind of medicine over the past 25, 30, 40 years and possibly more. And many people like myself have been gravely impacted by that situation. And you're one of the really few people who has the courage, who really has the stamina to highlight what is going on, and it's few and far between that somebody would, I think, in your position, stick their neck out. And so I feel really honored to even know you.
Thank you so much. So I sort of maybe would like to start out highlighting, one of the aspects of, I would say, corruption that I experienced during my career. There's been a number of episodes. Maybe we just sort of talk about two. One when I was at the CDC, and one when I was in the military. Mm-hmm. So when I was doing my fellowship in occupational environmental medicine at University of Cincinnati, there's a CDC in the local area, and I was working there. Sort of like as a pseudo internship, and sort of preparing myself to go on to one of their fellowships that they have, and that was my plan at the time. It didn't. I decided not to do it in the end before it started. But in any case, I was there. I was there in a meeting when there was a team that was commissioned by Congress to go and evaluate all the complaints that people had that were cleaning up the ground zero from when the Twin Towers came down. And because there were a lot of complaints of the people who cleaned up, they were having, joint aches and muscle aches and chronic cough and difficulty breathing, headaches, difficulty sleeping. And presumably there were the toxins in the air and the dust where they were working causing these symptoms. And it was just so overwhelming that there were so many people that were complaining. Congress had to commission the CDC to send a team down to evaluate. And this was a year and a half after the Twin Towers went down that this happened. So the team went down. They spent a few days in ground zero. I wasn't with the team, but I happened to be, because at the CDC, whenever there's a presentation that's going to be going to Congress, they sort of it's not a mock meeting, but it's basically a preliminary results meeting at the CDC to let everybody in the building who wants to come to see what the findings are before they bring them to Congress. So I just sort of went there for that meeting, and basically what they did is they took air samples, only, no dust samples at all, no soil sampling, and they didn't find anything in the air. So because there were no, and the other thing is, if you look at the particulate requirements for a hazardous exposure, they're actually pretty high. I mean, honestly, they're way too high, or higher than they should be. In other words, the threshold at which there's a concern. So if there's a particulate level of whatever it is, if it's under the threshold, even though there may be exposure and people may be having symptoms, if it doesn't reach the level of whatever the CDC or the EPA, there's all different. They all have similar levels. Then it wouldn't. Or the OSHA also has their levels as well. They're all very, very similar, not exactly the same. But air quality is going to be really bad, actually, to be a concern.
So many people could fall through the cracks, being sort of considered like in the safety zone, when in fact it's like not safe at all.
Right. So there was one time I was with the regional manager of OSHA. I was going around with him. He was sort of I was as part of this fellowship, actually, at UC. And basically what, really we talked a lot about this topic, actually. And it has to be so high that you actually have to, most of the time you're going to be seeing some particulate. That's how high it has to be. So air sampling is really never good anyway. It's almost never going to find anything unless you can see it generally. So in any case, a year and a half later, after the Twin Towers came down, they took air sampling and they didn't find anything. So they came back and they presented their results, and I was astonished. I didn't know that. I understand how air sampling works, but I assumed they were going to do some soil and dust sampling, and there was none. So therefore, they concluded that there's no claim. Basically, there's no reason. There's no explanation for these symptoms of these people that gave up their time and really gave up their health, to clean up ground zero. So I went after the meeting. I went up to the person who was in charge of the team, ran the meeting. I said, "Can I ask you a question?" It's kind of a foregone conclusion here that you're not going to find anything. You did air sampling. Why didn't you do soil sampling? And basically, his answer to me was giving me the analogy of what's going on in the fish industry, which I know a lot about because I did my master's on a topic of mercury. So I know a lot about mercury in fish. So basically, if you look at all the advisories of various waterways, especially in Ohio where I am, literally in every single waterway, whether it's a lake or a pond or a stream, there's advisories of every single one because of PCBs and mercury. Then, in other words, if you're going to fish in Ohio, probably the best you can hope for is don't eat the fish any more than once every 2 weeks. Some of them are once every month. Some of them it's not at all. There's so much toxicity because we're along the Rust Belt, and during the industrial period of the United States in the mid 20th century. There was so many factories polluting the environment, and a lot of stuff settled out in the soil and the water. And so they have advisories for fish. And in Ohio, it's terrible. Nobody should be eating.
Yeah, when you put the word fish and rust in the same sentence, I personally, would want to be cautious.
So I know a lot about mercury in fish, and generally the way it would get, say, in the ocean, it would be The coal plants would produce the smoke through the smokestacks, and at least to say 10, 15 years ago, 60% of all energy in the United States was by coal production. I don't know what it is now, actually, but it's a significant amount.
Mm-hmm.
So the coal plants are emitting metallic mercury. The metallic mercury gets solubilized in the rain, and then it brings it down. In other words, mixes with the water in the rain, goes down into the water, and the plankton and various other organisms, bacteria, can convert the metal mercury into an organic form, which means it's soluble in fat, which means it doesn't want to be in the water. Mm-hmm. So when fish come along in the water, then it stays in the fish because the fish are fatty,
right,
and the water's not. So it wants to stay in the fish. So the fish that accumulate mercury throughout its life, so it's called bioaccumulation of mm-hmm. mercury, and then it becomes, then when one fish eats another fish, like say a salmon or a tuna will eat another fish, it magnifies in the fish, and that's called biomagnification. So the fish can be swimming around like a millionfold increase of mercury in the fish compared to the water it swims in. So in mercury, it's a fat soluble form of the mercury. Therefore, a very, very fat rich organ of the body, especially of the fetus or a young child, is the brain. So it goes right to the brain of a developing fetus, developing child, and then it has a very, very long half-life. You can't chelate it. You can't give a medication to get rid of it because it's fat soluble. It stays in the fat. So the mercury accumulates in the nervous system. So that's the issue with fish, and it's a much bigger issue with pregnant women, because when a pregnant woman eats a fish, the organ in the pregnant woman that has the highest fat concentration is the fetal brain. So it goes right to the fetal brain preferentially, which is the most susceptible to damage because it's growing, it's developing. So most pregnant women, and pregnant women in most places, no matter where they get the fish, they shouldn't be eating any fish at all, honestly.
Now, let me ask you a question. Mm-hmm. Is, because you mentioned chelating the metals out of the brain, which is something that I know a lot about because of the mercury poisoning I had from my vaccine injury. Mm-hmm. Now, I was, over time, I don't know if it was because I wasn't, I wasn't a child and my blood-brain barrier had been formed by the time I'd gotten this vaccine injury, but I was successfully able to chelate the metals and the mercury out of my brain. It was processed, but I was able to do that. Now, is that different than the kind of chelation that would have to do if a pregnant woman was eating that level of mercury kind of soaked fish?
Yeah, well, I can say, first of all, the blood-brain barrier is a lipid barrier. Mm-hmm. So the organic form of mercury, which is mostly methyl mercury, it does go right through the blood-brain barrier. It stays in the brain, and ultimately the chelation of the mercury is when it's in some metallic form. And so whatever conversion it will do that your body has done into the metallic, and then you chelate it out, and obviously. It worked for you because whatever threshold it needed to go down to, so you wouldn't be symptomatic, you were able to get that much out. And the other thing is that because you're an adult, your brain's less fatty than a fetus or a young child. Mm. And there's probably still some mercury there, in your brain. There's no way to measure it, but if you ask any toxicologist, when you're chelating metals, it has to be soluble. Basically, you have to be able to link onto it. Mm-hmm. And if it's embedded in fat, you're not going to be able to link onto that metal. So whatever was leaching out of your brain, then the chelation will chelate it. Obviously, leaching out into the blood, mm-hmm. and then it would chelate, and then you eliminate it. So it's really kind of a relative term, really, but it's much more of a problem in children, or worse. It's worse in fetuses. I mean, if you there's a whole story that maybe your readers can read about if you want, or you can bring me out another time. We could talk about. Yeah. In Minamata, Japan, the disease is called Minamata syndrome, which is what you had, which is acute mercury poisoning. Mm-hmm. And then the whole story of Minamata, Japan, was able to flush out, and that's when we first discovered mercury. Causing neurotoxicity from fish, because it was a fish. Anyway, it's a whole big story. It's an interesting story. But there were many pregnant women where they were completely asymptomatic, and their fetuses came out either stillbirth or severe neurologic problems. In other words, the fetuses were much more susceptible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there were adults getting severe mercury poisoning too. Like the range of neurologic signs and symptoms is like the whole gamut of neurologic problems, like blindness, cranial nerve problems, pain, seizure disorder. There's a whole also big spectrum. In any case, so the point that I was sort of making though is that there's advisories on fish, whether it's state, local, or national, and the advisories are lower than that really what they should be. Okay. So, in fact, last I checked, the American College of Pediatrics and the CDC recommends that public schools shouldn't have tuna fish more than twice a week. Now, for my kids, like growing kids, I didn't want them to have any tuna at all. Because why is there's in toxicology there's two sort of categories of like they call it stochastic and non-stochastic. In other words, a risk and then a non-risk exposure. So like radiation or something, or that would be a risk. In other words, the more exposed, the higher likelihood you're going to get the bad outcome. Mercury is not a risk. It's basically an accumulate. It's like you get a little bit of mercury, you get a little bit of toxicity. You get more mercury, you get more toxicity. It's like, why would you want any toxicity? There's no threshold where it's safe. I mean, living organisms are not, at least humans are not. There's no safe level of mercury or lead or arsenic or aluminum. Like there are other metals that actually are beneficial in humans, as iron and copper and like some other ones, but there are some metals that don't belong in the human body that cause toxicity, even at very small doses. So there shouldn't be kids developing brains shouldn't have any mercury at all. That's my opinion. But the American College of Pediatrics says, well, they can have it no more than twice a week. And think about how many private schools. In fact, my kid's private school was serving it every day until me and my wife got involved and said, "Hey, here are these national organizations' recommendations that public schools are following. Why don't we follow it?" So then they changed it for that. But so now they're serving it twice a week. But even still, we trained our kids not to eat it at all. Mm-hmm. So I guess the to make a short story long here, the advisories are always way too. They're not enough. They're not severe enough as they should be. So the fish industry, he was telling me, this guy regarding the Ground Zero story.
Yeah,
he was sort of telling me that the fish industry has basically been calling the shots, so to speak. They're the ones that have allowed certain. They have to be consulted basically when there's advisories, because that's their industry. They're a lobby. They have a lobby. So they affect how Congress will pass. How they implement laws. And so because the fish industry has this influence, things have to be tempered.
Even threshold, even with respect to the threshold on the 9/11 Ground Zero, the fish industry.
Yeah, so that's where he was going with it. He was saying that we were. He didn't say it directly. He said it very indirectly. But I'll tell you what the message he was giving me is that I don't remember the exact words he was using, but we were told that we can't find anything. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what he was basically saying to me. He didn't say it in those words, but he did tell me though there are going to be back channels later outside of congressional hearings that we're going to get these people compensated, which is fine. But the question is where are the checks and balances here? How do you know who's going to compensate? What the compensation is going to be? There's no way to really.
And also, what's the public messaging? What now is the public messaging surrounding the very real, instances of harm, and these people don't get validated because there's got to be some kind of secretive back channel kind of way of saying what needs to be said, which isn't going to be said publicly. Well,
and if you notice, like I don't know if you noticed, I noticed that like in the news there were these reports of these people with symptoms or in the scientific world, and all of a sudden they just stopped. Mm-hmm. They stopped because the congressional hearings didn't find anything. End of story. No more news cycles on it. And then hopefully, I'm hoping they got compensated adequately. Hopefully all of them got compensated. There's no way to know. There's no way to know because that's the problem. The problem is that and that's corruption, in my opinion, because
Yeah.
right, you can't just leave it up to like these private backdoor deals. You know what I mean? This should have been as far as the public knows now. Nothing was validated.
Right, and herein lies the problem, because when you have these this public mixed up messaging based in some kind of corrupt model as opposed to data, then you have an entire public that truly has no idea what's going on, and then they're repeating all these flawed messages, and that carries over to all every other realm: vaccines, food, chemtrails, all these things that the public is kind of instructed, routinely instructed to have a certain messaging and have that messaging mirror, let's say, the CDC or the FDA or the EPA. And then you have all of these public speakers and public minds and public educators and media people who are now repetitively, over and over repeating these incredibly false narratives. And maybe they know, and maybe they don't know. And if they don't know, that's even worse, because I'm sure they're not going to be happy to think like, I have been repeating this, this saying, this mantra for 10, 20, 30 years. And who's listened to me? How many people have I affected with this sort of false information? And that's the problem. And it sounds like in that moment, was that your first wake up call there?
That wasn't the first. That was one of them. I can't remember. There's another story I want to tell you about in the military that there's been a few from the military, but that woke me up. But that was just one. I can't remember which came before what.
What did you walk away thinking, though? Because, whether it was your first or not, you walked away feeling some kind of some shift, something.
Well, actually, there were two episodes during that time. Also, there was another episode where I made a presentation on electronic waste recycling, which is 90% of it's done in China. Mm-hmm. And there's a very, very, very small amount of done in the United States. And I tried to investigate it. And it's completely closed off. If you wanted to figure out how much or what is done in the United States, electronic waste recycling, you will not be able to find anything because it's a closed box. And you can find out where that maybe the stuff is, whatever county is collecting it, whatever, for example, or whatever dump site is collecting electronic, where it may go, the inlet, and then that's it. You can't find out anything else after that. Because I did a lot of research on electronic waste recycling in China, because even though China is there's not a lot of occupational exposure data from China, but there's so much electronic waste recycling, mm-hmm. and there's been enough published where it was very eye-opening. So mm-hmm. I forgot what I was going to say regarding this topic.
Well, it was just another. It seems to be like another wake-up call that you had.
Right. So I was doing a presentation, and I was basically reprimanded afterwards, because there was something I found, a place that they were doing some dismantling of electronic waste recycling. And when you do some dismantling, part of that is breaking things open, breaking things, right, including breaking some of the components would include fluorescent light bulbs. And so, and when you break a fluorescent light bulb, guess what's released? Back to the same topic, mm-hmm, mercury. Mm-hmm, yeah. And it's metallic mercury. And metallic mercury gets, when you breathe it in, it's the most efficient way of getting into your body. Happens to be if you swallow it, like those old thermometers.
Yes, I remember.
You swallow that, most of it goes right through your alimentary canal out the other end. Mm-hmm. Very little gets absorbed. When it does get absorbed, very little gets into your brain because it's water soluble. It's not fat soluble. A very small percentage gets absorbed. Small percentage gets into the brain, and that's easily chelatable. Mm-hmm. But that's not really it gets much more efficiently in your blood. Say 5 to 10% gets into the neurologic system from your blood. So if you have a big dose that you breathe in your blood, then that's a bigger overall amount versus in your GI tract. Say 3 to 5% gets absorbed from the GI tract. and then a small percentage of that gets. So it's a big difference. So you're breathing in people who are working there, the workers were getting exposed to this, and I was basically exposing it during presentation, and I got reprimanded saying that there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. Do you understand that, I basically had to just destroy that presentation basically, and all that work I did to figure that out. There's a lot of there's a certain narratives that need to be, that are being followed. And by the way, and I'll tell you what, just before we leave the CDC topic, I'm going to with the final nail in the coffin with the CDC was this. When I was right after the pandemic was announced in March of 2020, I was off work for a month in April because I was changing jobs, and my previous job didn't have any more work because nobody was going to the ER because they were shutting all the ERs down. So I had the month of April off, and I was just doing a lot of reading and different things. So I decided to do a whole literature search on masks, on surgical masks, the cloth masks, and the N95 masks. So and most people don't know, even most doctors just don't know this. What does N95 mean? N95, N means non-oil. 95 means it stops 95% of 0.3 microns or greater. And what that is a HEPA filter. That's basically the smallest pore size of a regular filter, versus other ways of, you can take smaller particles on other ways, but in terms of filtration, that's the best we have, which is a HEPA filter. So the N95 is a HEPA filter, and by the way, in my training, I was taught that, surgical masks don't stop viruses. The only reason why we wear them in the operating room is so we don't drool in the wound. An N95 mask, or I was getting fit tested in the hospital as a TB mask. That's what its purpose was a TB mask. And it was quite clear to everyone at the time, a few decades ago, that it was to stop tuberculosis, which is a bacteria, which is much, 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 much bigger than a virus. It was never designed to stop viruses, and it was never even considered that it would be helpful for a virus. It was even the nurses fit testing me knew that and told me that. Somehow, the narrative completely changed, where now we're using these masks for viruses. So I did a literature search, and I did basically any outcome. If you look at different outcomes in research studies, there can be sort of laboratory ones where they may check things in a laboratory versus outcomes in a population. So there was a few studies that had been published up until that time that sort of concluded that, based on the comparison of all the literature at the time, that you can't use laboratory studies. Never use laboratory studies was sort of the that's where things were going in the literature. Only outcome studies, in other words, in a population. So if you have a population with the viral, influenza virus, and you put masks on everybody, does it slow down or stop the spread? It doesn't matter what happens in the lab, because if it doesn't work in a population, then the lab data is irrelevant. It may show it may stop certain things, but it doesn't matter if on the ground, in the real world, it's not doing any good. So the outcomes, those are the outcomes you need to focus on. And it happens to be during the pandemic, they only did laboratory studies to show any benefit, because you can't show population benefit because there is no population in any of these masks. So, and anyway, all the literature showed it does not stop viral infection.
You were hip to this early on, a couple months into the pandemic. You had some free time. You went in, you started really digging into the data, and you were like, so this mask is not going to stop whatever this is that's COVID-19. And that kind of brings us to a couple of forks in the road. Number one is COVID-19 is, my understanding, it was a bioweapon. Number two, there's a large population of scientists that have stated that COVID-19, that there are no viruses, the no virus theory, and that COVID-19 is not, in fact, a virus. And I'm just curious.
It might be a prion.
Okay,
that would sort of answer all questions. A prion is something smaller than a virus. Dr. Richard Fleming, who's a brilliant guy, MD, PhD, he's got a law degree. He was at the time, he was a couple of years ago, he was senior editor of 19 journals. The guy's super genius. He got his PhD 2 weeks after he graduated high school in physics.
Wow.
He's like one of those type of
He was
guys.
on the short bus, huh?
Yeah. So, and he's also he called the father of nuclear cardiology, because he basically developed all of a lot of the technology, the knowledge to make these nuclear medicine tests in cardiology. And he's also the ones who figured out the first one figured out the pathophysiology of myocarditis. So he's done a lot of things, this guy. So
Okay.
he's pretty convinced it's a prion. He gives a lot of explanation as to why, and that would sort of make a lot of sense. Um,
A
in any
prion
case,
as opposed to an what we consider
the
a
virus.
virus.
Yeah. But it's hard to me. It's at this point in time, I think that the jury's still on what it really is.
Mm-hmm.
So, but just to conclude this thing about the mask is that
Mm-hmm.
when I saw that after I'd done this whole literature search and I understood everything much more clearly,
Mm-hmm.
then I look into the CDC website and I see that they're teaching people how to make a cloth mask for themselves. And a cloth mask is like, I mean, the N95 pore size is 0.3 microns. The viral particle size is 0.06 to 0.12 microns in its range. So even the larger size viral particle, 0.12, is still 1/3 the pore size of an N95 mask. Then you go to the surgical masks, the pore size there is like 80 microns, and then the cloth masks are like much not even measured in microns. It's like much bigger. There's no way it would ever. There's no way a cloth mask is going to stop
Right.
anything.
It's
You know what I
like
mean?
putting like a screen door, you know,
It's yeah. I mean,
like
well,
a
they
window
say that
screen in front of your face.
the surgical mask, people have said this online many times, that the surgical mask, and I think it's an appropriate analogy, is like trying to stop a mosquito with a chain link fence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that
So
makes sense.
if you've heard that, but
Yes.
the cloth masks are much bigger pore size than the surgical masks.
Right.
So when I saw the CDC teaching people that you can step by step, I was like, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me with the CDC. I realized the CDC is entirely corrupt. I had some suspicions before
Mm-hmm.
and concerns, and so there's another instance at the CDC as well
Yeah.
regarding MWR, one of these reports I was writing. Anyway, so let's move on a little bit to my experience in the military. So there was when I was taking a job as a flight surgeon in a unit. I moved into this position, and that was the slot that I was put in. And the flight surgeon that was there, he was moving on to become a state surgeon in another state on the East Coast. That was his next step up. And I was taking his job. So everything's going well. The guy's really nice. I met him, he's seemed to be, very polite, nice guy. So it was a few months of an overlap in the transition, and his assistant, who was a sergeant, I saw him drawing an EKG on a light box. Right, he's copying an 12-lead EKG.
For what purpose?
I'll tell you what the purpose was.
Mm-hmm.
This was a unit of pilots, mostly helicopter pilots, right?
Mm-hmm.
And helicopter pilots have to get a physical exam every year to stay, and they needed to have they need to have all these boxes checked in order to fly. Mm-hmm. If you have any medical problems, they're not going to let you fly. Mm. So the way this flight surgeon was conducting everything was basically fraudulent. Mm. Everybody's getting the same EKG traced by this sergeant. I won't say his name. Mm-hmm. I still remember his name. Mm-hmm. And the blood work, they had a chest X-ray they were supposed to get every year. All this, everything that they were supposed to get there's no process even to get it done. Like there was a local hospital that you would think that because we didn't have any of the medical equipment, we would have to use a civilian contractor, right? Mm-hmm. And so I said, you know what? Let's do this the right. We didn't have an EKG machine. I said, let's do this the right way. Okay, let's try to get. Under my leadership here, we're not doing this. We're not copying EKGs. Right. And so I went to the hospital. I met with the hospital administrator and all these things. I was getting a whole process set up to get the blood work done properly, get chest X-rays set up. Right. Meanwhile, this has been done for years and years and years with nothing in place. It was all fabricated.
Why there was this creepy system in place where they, is it because they just knew everybody was unhealthy and wouldn't pass? Like, why were they doing
People were
it
just
this way?
nervous, I guess. Of course, the commander of the unit's a pilot, so like he's helping the rest of. They just wanted to be flying. They thought the
They just didn't
process
want to deal
was
with the red tape
yeah,
kind of
and yeah,
thing.
because and maybe some of them have had issues and they're like, I can fly. I don't know why, and they got around, eventually they sort of just figured that they can get around it, and the truth is it probably is a little over the top. Did they really need a chest X-ray every year? Probably not. But that was the military regulation, which is really a law. I mean,
Right.
it's a lawful order basically.
So you
To
observed them essentially breaking the law in order to
yeah,
pass their
yeah.
physicals.
Yeah. So then what happened was once I identified, I even spoke with the commander, right, of the unit. And I told him what I'm doing. I said, I'm gonna fix this. Don't worry about it. Next thing I know, on paper, the previous outgoing flight surgeon was now over me. They put me in a slot under, they put him back in, they put me under him, and they made him my rater. So they gave me something called an OER, officer evaluation report, that you have to get every year.
Mm-hmm.
And as an officer in the military, if you get a bad report, you're out, because
Mm-hmm.
you don't, as enlisted, you're there for a certain period of time. As an officer, like you're everything's conditional upon, you excel, you move up. You don't if you do get a bad OER, you're out. As an officer, you have to, because it's kind of like a pyramid in terms of like they need less and less officers as you go up. But the once your temporary period, that time period you've committed for is up, you're out if you get a bad OER as an officer. You either have to
Wow.
get center of mass, or you have to get much higher. You can't get lower than center of mass, they call it.
So you were punished basically
He gave me a
for
horrible. I've never seen one so bad, and it seemed, you know what I mean. And it was quite obvious to me. It's because I identified this corruption.
right.
So I told the commander about this, and he complained. He's like, he didn't. He was that just stone faced. Obviously, he's the one behind it. So I told him I'm gonna make some phone calls. I'm not accepting this, and I called the IG, the Inspector General. Okay,
Mm. Okay.
state,
Wow.
in the National Guard. Okay, I remember his name too. And guess what? Those guys were friends. You know that? The
Uh,
commander of this unit and the IG were friends.
right.
And I told, because he kind of knew about it already. I told him, I said, I'm just going to tell you now, if this is what I want. I want I want a good OER.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I'm going to process out. And if you don't fix this for me, I'm going to the media,
Mm-hmm.
because this is totally corrupt. It's easily provable, because
Mm-hmm.
there's not even any system in place. I said, I told him I'm going to the media, and you know what he did? He basically called the commander, and basically they gave me a different OER that was a little bit, wasn't great. It wasn't center of mass, a little bit, but kind of average of what you would expect. And I joined another unit. I was done with it, and I processed out.
So you blew the whistle and blew their cover and called
Yeah.
them on their bluff and they backed down.
Yeah. So, and this doesn't, this doesn't mean the whole military is corrupt, because I actually
Right.
have a lot of respect for the military. I'm proud of a lot of the things I did in the military, and I think if I had to do it over again, I would have stayed in the military more than 21 years. I did a career, and I got out. But I probably would have gone to something a little bit different. Maybe some different. There's other places there's various ways you can navigate in the military. You can have very very different experiences, depending on what your branch, where you go and what you do, kind of things. But anyway, so those are a few different
So those were
episodes.
experiences in during that period of time, it sounds like, which overlapped with COVID, of like awakening. And you were in some really I think some really governmental, strict, sort of ideologically particular places, like the CDC, like the military, places that operate in a certain way. There's generally not a lot of flexibility in thought. So, and they probably don't take kindly, as you experienced, to somebody speaking up, speaking out, speaking the truth, pointing out things that might not be right. And so that kind of shifted your focus, shifted everything for you.
Yeah, I think when you experience these things, just become much more open minded about maybe not always being following the following authority. The famous experiment at Yale, Stanley
Milgram.
Milgram, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, how much are we, how much are we amenable to just blindly following authority? And I think as a kid, to some degree, I was a little bit of a rebel growing up. I grew up in I grew up in a single parent home, and I had to sort of just make it on my own most of the time. I've been financially independent since eighth grade, basically, and then with some of these experiences also, I think by the time COVID hit, and after that experience with the CDC, I was open to anything. I was like, you know what, I'm not listening to anybody until I figure out myself, whether or not this is true, right? And so, and then comes along the vaccine, right? So I got really sick from COVID, and happened to be that I have some friends. I have very friends. One friend, this family owns, they're very, very, very wealthy. They own a very large healthcare organization, and they had doses of vaccines that we're giving out to people in their organization, and various other people they were helping out, let's just say. So I on behalf of another friend of mine, this family is extremely obese, I thought they were very high risk. I actually called my rich friends to try to get them some doses, which worked out fine. I was happy. I was like, but for myself, just because at that point in time, I was believing to some degrees, that there was, potential harm, especially high risk. And I wasn't going to take it myself, but I'm like, if I was them, I would have taken it because they're such high risk. I mean, I'm talking they're like 400 or 500 pounds. This family.
But at that point, we know now that there's no benefit to the COVID-19 vaccine and only risk, and that the more
100%.
obese you are and the more inflamed you are, like the worse everything is. Anything there's just nothing good about it. But what you're saying is that at that time it was so early on that you were kind of open to the possibility that it was a real vaccine.
I was open enough where this one family said, if anybody needs it, if there's any benefit, anybody would benefit. They said the risk benefit ratio, there's such high risk. I figured if there's any benefit, that might be the family to get it. So I helped them out and I got it. But meanwhile, for me and my family, I'm like, I want to know what's going on with this because we're not that high risk, especially my kids are not at risk at all. I mean, by let's say September, after it was called, a pandemic, right? From 2020, the end of September 1st. I remember at that time, there were 21 states where there was no one under the age of 30 had any deaths at all. 21 states. And so, when the low risk people, it's like, look, you got to really look at the risk benefit analysis. But so I myself, I wanted to learn how it worked first. Before I was, that was sort of my background living to that point where all right, I'm drawing the line here. I'm not going to take it. My family's not going to take it. I wouldn't recommend anybody else except there's one extremely high risk because this point in time, we don't know yet. So that might be one that would benefit. It turns out you're right. I agree with you 100%. The risk is much higher than no benefit, basically.
Right. So you started to so this was a whole process of awakening for you as an allopathic doctor, as somebody, and I think the whole audience would be really curious as to what was going on in the emergency room. How do you get around it? Obviously you had to wear a mask. You had to tell them you were vaccinated. You maybe had to had to turn people away who weren't vaccinated, or put them in there.
We were told in the ER. Okay, in the ER. This is another point of corruption. That we were supposed to ask every patient if they've had the COVID vaccine. If they haven't, I'm required to offer it to them. The truth is, I did not ask a single person, unless for other reasons maybe I asked, but I did not do that. I did not comply with that. I just kept under the radar, and that decree was only going on for a few months, and then it went away. But that was pretty ridiculous because it's not an emergency to get a COVID vaccine. You know what I mean?
Right.
It was all
Right.
because we were getting paid. You know, and I was required, and that by that point when that decree came out, I already figured out how it worked. And so early on, very early on, when it first came out, I was thinking to myself, I understand. I understand how basically what the Johnson and Johnson basically they put the sequence of the spike protein into a virus that they inject in you, and that virus goes in and downloads this DNA into your DNA. So you get a change in your DNA. And then the Moderna and the Pfizer is a messenger RNA system, which they inject into you. And we were told it stays local, but it doesn't. We know that now. It does not stay local. That was a lie. That was one of many lies. So the messenger RNA basically when it gets injected into you, it goes in. It uses your own cellular machinery to produce the spike protein. So basically, it brings itself through these lipid nanoparticles into your cell without destroying the cell. And then it uses your own ribosome, and the messenger RNA goes through the ribosome and produces this protein that's the spike protein that goes on the in the surface of the cell. And then after that, by the way, there's a paper published in 2021 that showed that the messenger RNA also on these two the messenger RNA also includes the code for the reverse transcriptase enzyme. And so that photocopies the messenger RNA and puts it into your DNA. So they all get into your DNA permanently. But at least for Johnson and Johnson earlier on, when we know went to the DNA, I was saying to one of the colleagues at work, I'm like, how do we know it's like not going to randomly go in right in the middle of a tumor suppressor gene? What that is basically, there's two basic fundamental reasons why we get cancer, right? So one is an oncogene, which means it's a gene that will make the cell divide. If it's an abnormal gene, hopefully nobody has an oncogene. If you have an oncogene, then people get cancer. If you have a tumor suppressor gene, we have all over the place in our genome. And what it does, it stops the division of cells. It stops basically cancer from developing. It'll stop that cell from dividing. These are all over our DNA. If you have an abnormal tumor suppressor gene, that's how people can get cancer. So the BRCA gene, have you heard of that?
Sure.
It's a lot of people have that gene. And that's an abnormal tumor suppressor gene. That's an example of an abnormal tumor suppressor gene. So if it goes in the middle, if this vaccine goes right in the middle of a tumor suppressor gene, it's going to make it abnormal. It's not going to work because it's again the sequence is messed up, and that could cause cancer. So I was theorizing, and I was called an anti-vaxxer at work when I was talking about this. But I was just
at your hospital among your colleagues.
Yeah,
at the hospipital you're working at, they were like,
the one person did say to me, like, that's probably the only thing that you could say that maybe is concerning, that makes sense or that's legitimate. Because I was questioning the whole thing, as it turns out, there was a paper published December 2024, I think it was, the multi-hit hypothesis article. That basically shows it's showing that it does. There's a lot of evidence that it does cause an abnormal it's called P53, which is a tumor suppressor gene. It does cause an abnormal tumor suppressor gene.
Is this why we're seeing turbo cancer everywhere? Is this why we're seeing thousands and thousands, 1,000% increase in cancers that like children don't normally get, and all these other sort of random cancers in people under 30 that everybody's seeing?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, that article I'm referring to shows you in multiple ways how it causes cancer. Multiple ways. So that's the reason. Yeah, it's not just that one thing. It's many, like there's a molecule called pseudouridine, which is a well-known carcinogen. I'd heard this from the guy named Dr. David Martin, brilliant guy.
I know of David Martin. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was talking about this pseudouridine. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to look that up. I looked up. Yeah, pseudouridine is a well-known carcinogen. Okay. And then I looked up in the literature, did they add it to the vaccine? Yeah, they did. They added, I think, the 5' end of the vaccine. So they're adding the reason they give is to stabilize the messenger RNA. But the bottom line is they're adding in a carcinogen onto this messenger RNA as well. So that's the second reason. There's multiple reasons. There's really 7 different ways it actually causes cancer
that we know of, that's been documented.
Yeah, and this paper that I'm referring to has 255 references in its reference list, taken from the PubMed, the scientific database. This is not a conspiracy paper. This isn't an opinion paper. This is all evidence-based from the literature, 255 references.
And has all of conventional medicine and allopathic medicine and your colleagues and people who you rely on to know what they're doing, right? I mean, because it's not just you holding down the fort, of sanity. It's you have to work with other people who you pray know what they're doing when they're trying to save somebody's life. So do these other people and all of this sort of the zeitgeist of allopathic medicine now understand what has happened?
A lot of them don't, and they're still like in this trance. Honestly, I'll give you an example. And I believe it was February 2021. Still early, but a year after it was called a pandemic, right? There was a paper published in Science. I mean, a creme de la creme journal. It's like Science is like if a person publishes in Science, you're like, you're considered, you're the top 0.01% of scientists. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. That's like a great thing to do. The articles coming out of Science, New England Journal of Medicine, these top journals have been considered in the past, extremely reliable articles. So there's been some corruption recently since COVID, but this one article showed that and they looked at it in multiple different ways. It was a brilliant article showing that when a person gets COVID, they get life-sustaining immunity. And through these, through the data that they had, as well as the calculations to extrapolate out, they basically showed that you have pretty much a 90-year sustainability of immunity to the COVID virus once you get the COVID virus. And the immunity that you get, the IgG to the nucleic capsid, to the spike protein, the B cells, the T cells, the IgA, the IgG, and all these different, all the different things they looked at and showed it was a brilliant study. And so I thought it was an amazing study. And this was during a time where we were and I was part of the faculty of the medical school, part of a department in the medical school. And we were having conversations about residents getting vaccinated, medical students getting vaccinated. So I brought up in 2 different meetings, one with a resident meeting, like, here's my question, why are we making the residents get vaccinated if they've already had COVID-19 virus, right?
And what was the response?
There was no response, right? The entire faculty was silent. And because they were literally just brainwashed. And then I had another meeting in the medical school with many different of the medical students, with all the course directors of all the fields, OBGYN, surgery, pediatrics, surgery, emergency medicine, all of them. And so I asked the same question. I said, why? Because the topic was getting vaccinated, making sure everybody's getting vaccinated, right? Mm-hmm. So why? I need to ask a question here. Why are we requiring vaccines for those who have already had the COVID virus? Complete silence, right? So then when this article,
my question is what do you think they're thinking? Like I just want to know, are they thinking, oh, he's asking that and we knew he was going to ask that because we know it's totally wrong and it goes against the data to be doing this? Or I wish he'd stop asking that because then we have to tell him the truth, which is it's really not about the vaccine. It's about compliance or maybe federal grants. I
don't know.
What was going on?
I think so differently. I just think, I don't know. I can't wrap my head around what was going on in their head. The information comes in from the CDC and they just grab a hold of it and they just hold on to it and they lose all their cognition. That's it. They learn any logical reasoning is out the window. So what I did was when this article came out in Science in the February 2021, like, this is awesome. And I'm in charge of journal club for all the residents. Like, I don't know how many residents are there, like probably 60 residents or so. Or so I think it's 80 total, but the average people that show up to the journal club is a lot of residents, like interns and residents, right? There's some medical students there too, doing rotations. And so I was in charge of this one journal club, and I'm like, we're looking at this article also, right? So because the attending picks all the articles, so I included this article, and then it was like when one of the residents presented it, it was like kind of like eye rolling. Dr. Bernstein wants me to present this article, like and he presented it, it really condensed version of it. And then I summarized it after that, because I feel like he didn't see it. I don't know what was going through. Maybe they don't believe it. I don't know what the case. It was a brilliant article with like, I don't know, but probably like 20 different authors, right? From very prestigious universities, and it's in a prestigious journal, and like in showing that you have lifelong immunity when you get the virus. Like, how is that not like earth-shattering information that I've touched on in 2 different meetings, and that's like the elephant in the room regarding vaccinations. Why is it not shaking the ground of anybody who's listening to it? I don't know. I don't know. I can't figure it out.
It's astounding, and it brings me back to, as you know, my favorite subject, which is Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, where she wrote, once she watched the Nuremberg trials, that it's not like some Hannibal Lecter, like that's like your evil guy, somebody like frothing at the mouth and like super crazy and dangerous. It's not that at all. That's not evil. It's just your kind of average buttoned up bureaucrat who is quite frankly not scary at all, who pets their dogs and takes their kids to play dates and pays their taxes and has like good teeth and stuff like that. Right. That's what she outlined in The Banality of Evil, and it really hasn't changed. And I do believe that we saw her thesis come to life even more, because the Nuremberg trials, we highlighted just a few people, but what she was saying was that it's all of the people who do their smaller, everyday, daily, day in, punch the clock, stamp this thing, go to a meeting, have a sandwich, go home, and not really sit back and take into consideration the ramifications, the larger impact of what they do on a daily basis. And that's really, I think, what we saw overall during COVID. And you were, and a handful of people were these brave, whistleblowers, and where it comes from in each person is also fascinating. Like for me, I mean, I knew right away that the whole thing was like really a scam, because I had already been vaccine injured. I'd been studying this for 10 years. I understood what RFK Jr. was saying. I understood what vaccines were. I had worked with toxicologists to get chelated, toxicologists who, had run-ins with the government and stuff like that. And so I was privy to a lot of these things. And so I was awake. You had these experiences, but it sounds like it was also built upon the foundation of your childhood. You had a childhood that kind of prepared you for the necessity to be awake, scrappy, informed, eyes open kind of thing. Am I right? I mean, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think so. And the way I look at it is, I think that people have had difficulties in their life. I think what they do emotionally, and maybe even in many cases spiritually, is they mature faster. I think these difficult, challenges or tests, trials in a person's life, you progress in this in the evolution that we're all sort of going through in life of maturity, psychologically, spiritually, and that's what I think life is about ultimately trying to do God's will and trying to bring God into the world, and that's what we're here. That's what we're here for. And I think people have had more tests and trials, go through that a little bit more faster. And I think maybe that's why that's how I understand. That's how I look at myself. Let's put it that way.
That's really beautiful. I mean, we have definitely like a kindred spirit in that way, because I feel like, when you do have these trials and tribulations that maybe not everybody around you has, you tend to put a different lens on, and you view the world in like a different way, and you want to think and you try to think, how can I bring more light into this dark situation? How can I either bring the light, or how can I be the light? And that really, what's the light, in my opinion, is the disinfectant of truth. The truth is that kind of disinfectant. It's the light. And that's really essentially what you've been doing during this period, which quite frankly sounds maddening. And I wasn't even a doctor, or in the military. And it was so frightening to me to be in the culture. I had to leave LA. We were like exiled, from Hollywood and Los Angeles and production and that whole culture, because we just couldn't live in that scenario, because it felt like kind of like a pressure pot. It was constantly boiling up and up and up, and there was no room for alternative voices or alternative opinions. And in your situation, we're talking like life and death. You're trying to do a job, save people's lives.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah.
Right. Totally.
Well, is there anything else that you want to kind of bring forward here that you maybe haven't talked about before and you feel like is an important topic?
No, I think this probably is good for today.
Okay.
I think what we'll do when we meet next time, I'll finish this. I'm working on a presentation of just looking at overall vaccines, and this is sort of my new interest right now.
Great.
And I'm specifically not including the COVID vaccine in this literature review. I just want a sort of overview of the scientific literature showing some of these really horrible outcomes in populations and in people who have been vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And there's a lot of data out there.
Yes.
And if you want to look at the opposite, if you want to see, well, maybe there's data that shows maybe there's another side to that argument, it's not there. It's not there. So this presentation, when I finish it, hopefully be done the next day maybe. I'll challenge any pediatrician, anybody in allopathic medicine to watch it and give me the rebuttal. I'll debate anybody on the topic because there is no data showing that vaccinated populations are healthier. It just doesn't exist.
In fact, there seems like there's only data that shows that the unvaccinated children and the unvaccinated populations far outweigh their performance. Right. Far outweighs the vaccinated children, and that right. Data is for sure out there.
Right. Yeah. So maybe we meet next time. I'll give that presentation. And
I would love to do that presentation, and I'd also love to be the moderator or the fly on the wall for your challenge with a pediatrician or an allopathic doctor or another allopathic doctor or somebody who, feels strongly in the opposite direction. I think that would be awesome.
Right. All right. Sounds good.
Cool. Well, it was so fantastic to have you on today, and I thank you for all that you do. And I'm sure everybody listening to this feels hope after hearing you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for being here and for remembering that healing is not a destination. It's a reclamation of your mind, body, and spirit. If you found me through my Substack, please be sure to subscribe here as well. This is where the soul-affirming conversations live. Each episode is filled with riveting truths and invitations to push past boundaries you didn't even know you had. If this episode stirred something deep inside you, share it with someone who needs to hear this. You are not broken, and anything can be healed. Subscribe to Broken and Healed wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel called, leave a review. Your words help this medicine reach more hearts. Until next time, remember, your voice, your body, your story, they're sacred. Till next time.